You knew this was coming. I kept teasing it, and if nothing else, if I was ferociously fanboying over Halo for the Covenant and Forerunners, I couldn't have just ignored the faction that is pretty much responsible for everything we see in the Halo universe.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. Without them, we'd have no... anything. There'd still be
I mean, the Flood is such a massive driving force in the Halo universe. It would feel incomplete without them.
Forerunner domination of the galaxy, and mankind would... Actually, I don't know. Part of the reason for the Forerunner-Human War was because humanity was simultaneously retreating from and eliminating these parasites. Who knows what would have happened had they not intervened? There's something you should know, though. While I will, of course, talk about what you're likely familiar with in this miniseries, and without spoiling it too early, I'll actually give the factions in 40k some credit for once. The creatures you know from the original Halo trilogy were once far different from their modern iterations. What became a cruel and corruptive zombie-like hive mind was once the most dominant race in the Halo universe. And yes, I mean universe. So in a way, this is a bit of a 2-for-1 video. The first portions will largely be lore and the precursors, because in order to understand the main subject of the video, I feel obligated to do my best to explain what we know about them. And of course...
Yeah, the precursors are kind of the thing that ended up turning into the Flood in the first place, yeah. And the knowledge of one of those primordial precursors is also inside of the Grave Mind, which makes that incredibly powerful.
The more I'm talking about Halo, the happier I am. I'll try not to focus on them too much when they were the precursors, and I'll chapter the video, so if you just want to skip to the 40k bits, feel free. But to finally stop beating around the bush on this matter, allow me to tell you how the Flood of Halo could devour the 40k galaxy. But first, a word. Not from a sponsor. Haha, I fucking gotcha, didn't I? No sponsor this one, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you all. Nearly to 100k and a new year's coming up, so I hope everyone else has a good new year, and I hope this channel does as well. Insurance issues that'll haunt me for the rest of my life aside, this has pretty much become my full-time job, and I couldn't do it without all of you. How fitting the Dexcom be talking about insurance bullshit. But seriously, thank you all for the support. Now then, I hope you're wearing a Class 12 combat skin, because otherwise you're in for a rough time.
I am a monument to all your sins.
Unlike 40k's own devouring hive mind race, the Flood were not always... well, what I just described. They were once a race known as the Precursors. I'm tempted to describe them as the Forerunners on steroids, but that doesn't come close to what they were. Because what they really were H.P. Lovecraft gods. To say they ruled the universe is a funny way of putting it, because they had interesting outlooks on reality, but if they wished to, I've no doubt they could've. Before I get into their tech and all that stuff you're no doubt terribly interested in, so you could explain how Cato Sicarius could one-shot them, I want to talk-
I, Cato Sicarius, have achieved victory over the Forerunners as well as the Precursors and the Flood. What a guy. I think the easiest comparison to the Precursors with the Warhammer 40k universe would be the old ones, yeah. Although there are certain differences between them.
Talk about them for a bit. They seeded life in the galaxy billions of years ago, so already we're on a timescale well past 40k's own. They could accelerate the evolution of life as fast as or as slow as they wished it to be, and the reverse was true as well. They would oftentimes spend their lives as devolved, humble farming races, for the form they took was of no consequence to them. One day they might decide to be Cthulhu, the next day they're Gilgamesh, and then 100,000 years later they're Farmer Brown counting his space chickens for the yearly harvest. Don't think about that sentence too much. I grew up in the suburbs, alright? They believed that the universe itself was alive in a way, only in a way and scale far different from you and me. They believed that the consciousness of living beings served to enrich the universe as a whole, a concept in Halo known as neural physics. If this is sounding like some real hippie shit to you, then you're probably right. But if the hippies are able to throw galaxies at you like ping pong balls, maybe they're onto something. But before that, a bit of how—
honestly true. The worst part about Gurren Lagann is that you run out of Gurren Lagann to watch. That show was peak. I don't think anything has ever come close to getting me that hyped over something. And maybe some of the newer anime fans would be like, but Jujutsu Kaisen! And I'm like, yeah, you guys can enjoy what you want to enjoy. I don't think it'll ever surpass Gurren Lagann.
How they viewed life. They weren't good or evil, strictly speaking, but they considered suffering, strife, and indeed evil as necessary parts of life. They believed it added to its sweetness, which is the only word I can give you because whatever word they would have used didn't really cross the language barrier so goodly. Now for their tech abilities and all that good stuff. Part of what helped them be able to—
well, why are we doing this? While there are some pretty good isekai shows out there, most of them, yeah, not so much. I think it's a pretty common concept, though, for the godlike beings to be pretty impartial about all things. To understand that concept that good and evil coexist with each other, and one cannot survive without the other.
To live so many different lives is that they could reincarnate and live anew. Death, after all, is just another part of life, so of course they wish to experience it every now and then. And in a rare moment of me actually dissing the Eldar, the precursors managed to do this for billions of years without murder-fucking a god into existence. Good job, precursors. They also weren't a hive mind, by the way. Not yet, anyways, so this was straight-up reincarnation, not having your brainwaves vored back into a collective consciousness. They could do pretty much everything the Foreigners could do. You know, cross into different universes, throw planets at people to piss them off, the usual. Except with the precursors, it wouldn't be a planet, it'd be a galaxy. Now that's a good way to tell someone to fuck off. I'm not making that up, by the way. The Foreigner known as the Didact had a freak out when he learned what they could do, i.e. throw galaxies around. Just moving them around like Minecraft blocks and creating life from nothing. Their FTL methods were described as leaving lingering multiversal residue when they entered real space again. I have no idea what the hell that means, but I'm going to assume that means they just waltz through other realities to reach their destination like a goddamn nether portal system. And there's my favorite invention of theirs as well, star roads. Now that sounds kinda boring, I admit. What they were roads between
Zero just makes me think of that one map in Mario Kart. What was it? Rainbow Road? Oh god. Friendships died there. Although, to be fair, that entire game and Mario Party is what you play in order to destroy your friendships.
planets and potentially even different star systems, miles and miles thick and immune to all forms of attack. Let the scale of that sink in a bit. A road between a star system. Not like a Stellaris hypertravel lane, a physical thing. These things stretch between
Stellaris is something that I've seen a lot of people suggest I check out videos on. It's a grand strategy game that I've been taking a look at for a while now. Like, even before I got into Warhammer. But it just seems quite daunting.
planets. That's something billions of miles long, and these things were everywhere. They could also change their mass at will. Not as in they could shed bits of themselves as required, so they were lighter or heavier. One section of the road might be 100 pounds 1 minute, the next is 10,000, and then after that it's 10. Nothing about the road was changed, there was no rearrangement. Reality has been rewritten, so this thing is now a different mass. That shows a complete mastery of the universe like no other, because it's just rewriting reality on a whim. And while the precursors didn't really use them for violence, the Flood used them to strangle planets. They did that with the first arc the Foreigners built, which was itself bigger than the one in Halo 3, which was in turn itself several dozen times the size of a planet. Imagine being some foreigner just chilling out on a planet, living life, then the galactic Autobahn comes screaming out of space and strangles your planet into a black hole before smacking your fleet out of orbit like a game of whack-a-mole. And the domain I discussed in the Foreigner video was their creation. They wanted to store all they had gathered about the universe in one giant sentient super
Ah, okay. Yeah, there were some comments from the previous video talking about this, how the galactic internet was made by the precursors.
computer that used the very Milky Way galaxy to run itself. Aside from doubtlessly being able to run Doom, it was also able to shut out those it didn't like.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it could run Doom. I remember seeing those videos of people trying to test out different electric appliances and seeing whether or not I could run Doom. I think people were able to play it like using their fridge or like using a device powered by a potato. Doom is just, it runs.
This is why the Foreigners, despite being able to access whatever they put into it, noticed massive blank spots of information they couldn't access. The domain itself was telling them to go to hell, they just didn't realize it. Now, if they were so powerful, how did they disappear like all ancient precursor civilizations do? Well, the Foreigners wiped them out. So how did they do that? Great question. There are several answers presented, and none of them come from a completely reliable source. What I can tell you isn't true is what the Foreigners largely believed. They thought the precursors peacefully faded away and left them in charge. That theory is historical revisionism to the highest that Foreigner commanders spread after they murdered all the precursors to make Foreigners feel good about themselves. After this one, though, the theories get screwy. A precursor survivor, and I use that term very loosely, says that the Foreigners attacked them unprovoked. Imagine if every single insect in your backyard suddenly marched into your room and started devouring you. That's essentially what this kind of precursor said had happened. Doesn't matter how strong you are if you're 110% blindsided. Meanwhile, Foreigner accounts by those who actually know a bit about what happened say that instead of passing the role of guardians of all life onto the Forerunners, they were going to give it to humanity instead and genocide the Foreigners out of existence. In this version of the story, the Foreigners just got the jump on them before they could do it. So using that insect analogy again, imagine it's largely the same, only the bugs got wind that you were going to call an exterminator in a few days.
I wonder which side is true. Like, is there any absolute confirmations here? Or is this more of a like leave it up to interpretation? Honestly, maybe I would prefer it if it's just a mystery, that there is this story that has certainly happened between these two races and a war occurred, but there isn't really any confirmation as to who started it or who was in the wrong.
There's also the possibility that many precursors simply let the foreigners kill them because of that whole life is both joy and suffering thing they had going. Whatever the case, the specifics are both incredibly violent and lost to time, as shown by when the Didact found out just what they could do and he freaked out and wondered how the hell the foreigners ever beat them. Of course, this was still a race of Lovecraftian beings that only technically aren't gods. Kind of hard to kill them. And indeed, at least a few of them retreated out of the Milky Way in some form or another. One of the forms many of them took was as a powder that would eventually coalesce back into precursors proper. But be it the ravages of time or sabotage, something happened to this powder and it was...
But then this powder turned into what we know as the Flood. During the timeline video that I watched, it was pretty glossed over. Just some funky space stuff happened, and then they became this Flood thing that devoured the entire galaxy, which was why the Forerunners had to create the Halo rings. But let's see if we get some more details here.
Was corrupted. Instead of reforming the precursors, it created a new form of life that was hell-bent on revenge, one that would assimilate all into itself so that never again could its creations rise up against it. This powder, as you've no doubt guessed, became the Flood. The Warhammer scenario is coming soon, I promise, but to
Maybe it was due to the intentions of the precursors that were twisted. Maybe there was some, I don't know, I guess bad juju energy surrounding all of that. If this was Warhammer 40k, it could pretty easily be explained by chaos corruption.
explain the Flood, imagine the Tyranids, okay? Now instead of them just eating you, they shove a toddler-sized ball of popcorn in your chest and you become one of them. Everything you know of value is then assimilated into the hive mind of the Flood. Everything useless to them is discarded. Not shoved to the back of your mind, not moved around in your neurons, gone. Deleted. Error 404. Fond childhood memories of your mother not found. The novelization of Combat Evolved shows Captain Keyes going through this as he desperately dredges up memories from his past that the Flood has to go through before it can find the location of Earth, as well as him constantly repeating his military identification number over and over so he always has something to use as a shield to almost keep sane. As they grow in number, they begin harvesting corpses to form a grave mind, the true guiding intelligence of the Flood, an intelligence far beyond any AI. If there is anything remotely biological, the Flood can consume it. While there are beings in Halo that cannot be infected by the Flood due to lacking a central nervous system, most prominently the Hunters, their biomass can still be absorbed and used by it. All of your secrets are learned, all of your tactics, your battle plans that you're aware of, how your logistical networks run, everything. To get back,
that is a very cute picture of a dog. But I think comparatively, the Tyranids, they take some time to adapt to whichever opponent that they're facing off against. And considering the tools at their disposal, they've done a pretty good job of doing that. I find it hard to think of a counterpoint as to how the Flood wouldn't just be much more effective at doing the things that the Tyranids are doing. Because as long as the Flood gets control of, like, say, one Space Marine or even a, God forbid, a official of high ranking within the Imperium, then the Grey Mind would literally understand almost everything about how all their stuff works, or whatever knowledge of the being that they took over possessed. That kind of is just straight up better than adapting to an opponent. You just become your opponent. I also wouldn't be surprised if the Flood was able to very easily understand how to utilize the warp, or like psyker powers, as long as it's got its hands on a psyker, or any being who has knowledge of chaos. Which makes me wonder, would Nurgle be okay with the Flood? I don't know. It's not really a disease. And how would the Flood even interact with chaos demons? Because when demons die, they just kind of dematerialize and go back to the warp, yeah? Lots of questions.
Back to Halo, when this powder came back, ancient humanity decided to give it to their pets to make them more attractive and fertile. I fucking wish I was kidding. I mean, is that not the first thing you think of, too? Oh wow, look at this cool mushroom I found in the forest. Hey, Fido, come lick it for me. I think it'll give me some real cute puppies. Halo lore gets weird, man. God. Then their puppies started getting a little silly, just a little bit wacky. Then space zombies happened, and ancient humanity and their allies, the ancient prophets, just gonna skip past that without explaining it, no time, waged war on the Flood. When it spread to foreigner planets, they started getting rid of those planets. For some reason, they didn't explain that there was a zombie apocalypse going on in ancient foreigner society, so they thought humanity was just just randomly invading them for shits and giggles. Humanity fights a two-front war and loses, the Flood pretend to be driven off so the foreigners think they're secure to the Flood, and then they hardcore prank the foreigners by revealing that no, there's not a thing like that before reactivating all of their dormant tech to wipe the foreigners out.
That's the thing. They're not some mindless plague that consumes galaxies. They have strategy, and they can be controlled as long as a gray mind exists. Now granted, if I remember correctly, if a gray mind is destroyed, then the guys, they kind of lose their direction and go a little bit berserk. But the thing about the gray mind is that you can't truly destroy it. As long as there's enough biomass, I think, eventually it just reforms and then takes control over the Flood once again. And I think there's also like multiple gray minds at once, just in like different parts of the galaxy. Memory's a little hazy on that though, so I could be wrong.
And it nearly worked. As the foreigners were losing ground, the Flood's absorption capabilities meant that they learned more and more about foreigner tech, as well as how to use and counter it. Every killed foreigner was another Flood to worry about, classic zombie stuff. And eventually, the Flood hit critical mass and formed a key mind. If a grave mind is smart, a key mind makes Tzeentch look like Gork and Mork. It is the ultimate intelligence, capable of guiding the Flood across the galaxy simultaneously and infecting space-time itself. Yeah.
Something even greater than the grave mind? This I wasn't aware of. What did he say? A key mind?
The Flood have their own form of chaos corruption if you let them get out of control. As they devoured huge swaths of the galaxy, the foreigners also learned the hard way that the Flood could control the tech they had as precursors, and that's when foreigner planets started getting strangled by those fancy star roads. Even their AIs became infected. Remember what I said about them being smart? The key mind is so bullshit intelligent that they just corrupt machines despite it being purely biological. The main
I think this was something that happened with the AIs that were sent to interrogate, like, the precursor, or the primordial precursor that was captured. And I think Cortana was also captured, and that's one of the reasons why her rampancy just went off the rails. I think it was called something like a logic virus.
main foreigner AI in charge of the military, Metacount Bias, was turned to their side after being locked in the science fiction hyperbolic time chamber with a grave mind for a few years. So don't think you're safe just because you've replaced your lungs with a forge below tech priests. As for how the Flood were defeated, it was because the Halo array was almost accidentally designed to utilize neural physics for its firing sequence, which turned all those fancy precursor weapons into soup. It also killed everything left alive in the galaxy by that point, which meant the Flood were starved out, much like the Tyranids would have been in this situation. Unrelated, but there was a bit in the Foreigner novels where, right as the rings are being activated, the Isodidact hears the signals of a race that was just beginning to reach the stars, which is both incredibly depressing and incredibly funny. Imagine—
Bruh. Oh man, imagine spending so much time building up your civilization, finally launching a spaceship out there to discover new life in the galaxy, and then getting completely wiped out without even knowing what or why. That is so tragic, but that's just life, I guess.
Imagine you move into a new neighborhood, and the day after you finish setting everything up, you walk outside to go say hi to your new neighbors and immediately get hit with the spirit bomb. Alright, I feel like there's more I can say, but I'm over 8 pages of script into the video, and I haven't started the actual Warhammer crossover bit. Didn't plan on this video just being half Halo lore, but here we are. So, how would the Flood fare in the 40k galaxy? I won't be doing the precursors themselves as they were, because to be frank, I think it'd just be a guaranteed win for them. They'd leave the galaxy and toss another one at it. If they failed, they'd do it again and again and again. Or just create a race with the sole purpose of influencing the warp and creating their own chaos god, if not outright descending themselves to become a new race of the old ones. More so than they already were anyways. Now if you look at the title of this video, which I assume you did, you probably noticed the big glaring could in the title. Because unlike the Covenant and Forerunners, I don't think the Flood is guaranteed to either hold their ground or sweep the galaxy. They could do either, but to show what I mean—
That is a fair point. There are certain conditions that need to be met in order for the Flood to completely dominate. If they are unable to meet these conditions, then they'll just get wiped out. Because, like, with the Imperium, we have Exterminatus. We have ways of completely starving the Flood, or eliminating it completely from a planet. As long as the proper countermeasures are taken, then yeah, there would certainly be a good fighting chance against the Flood. It's just that I'm not informed enough about how the Warhammer 40k factions would come up with their battle strategies, or like how fast they'd be able to pick up like what exactly the Flood does and how to counteract that. I mean, there's probably something similar already in the 40k universe, because I wouldn't be surprised if there was some sort of zombie virus out there that they know of, that Nurgle kind of made and the Imperium has had to deal with. Or like how other Xenos races could potentially have a weapon that would just very easily deal with the Flood.
Let's start with Scenario 1. The Flood gets wiped from the galaxy pretty quickly. Let's start the scenario off on an Imperial world. Doesn't matter much which it is. Don't worry about how it got there, it's not important. It shut off a Flood ship on their way across the multiverse to go curb stomp some foreigner or something. Don't think about it. What's important is what it's gonna do, namely infect some poor schmuck on his way to work or something like that. Could be a hive world, could be an agri world, doesn't matter. Rapidly, the Flood begins to infect others as it does. It can spread through spores in the atmosphere as well as the popcorn balls. It's just that either for technical or balancing reasons, it never does this in the Halo games, if only so the Arbiter doesn't get turned into a zombie when he shows up to give you a lift out of high charity in Halo 3. But that does mean that even if you don't get caught by infection forms, you're still joining their ranks when the air turns to cancer. Now, taking into account both the Flood's capabilities and my intense favoritism of Halo, I'm gonna say this scenario is in the middle of the three in terms of which is most likely to happen. It also relies heavily on one thing: competent Imperial officials. As the Flood infects more and more people, someone important realizes that shit is about to hit the fan hard if this problem isn't taken care of quickly. Let's say there's an Inquisitor like Amberly Vale or Crypt.
I think when it comes to whether or not, Warhammer 40k officials will completely nuke a planet or shoot first before asking questions, I feel like it's a pretty good bet that they would take drastic measures, because we've had to deal with worse. Well, maybe not worse, but we've had to deal with a lot of horrible things over the course of several years. So this is probably just par for the course. If there's anything extremely valuable on that planet, then I don't think they would immediately nuke it with an Exterminatus. But if the Imperium felt like there was only one way to get rid of this Flood, and then they would sacrifice it. We've sacrificed plenty of things to survive already.
Cryptmen into the system while the outbreak is happening. The Flood are many things, and they can be subtle on a grand level. After all, the foreigners didn't really know about the Flood's true capabilities at first, and weren't really aware of it at all when the humans and prophets were trying to take care of it. That being said, on the local level, it is anything but subtle. You can't hide a Flood infection. I mean, look at this thing. This doesn't exactly fit in with the Imperium's ideal of the holy human form, now does it? Unless I missed something in the 9th edition core rules that says Taco Bell diarrhea is now considered sacred. As the parasite spreads across the planet, so an important manages to order what needs to be done. Exterminatus of the planet. Doesn't really matter what kind of bomb you use, either way, the end result is that the planet is bathed in fire and the Flood perish alongside everyone on the planet.
Yeah, there's no way a Flood is gonna survive a virus bombing. I had asked that, I think it was in the previous video or during one of the Emperor TTS episodes, but it sounds pretty intense, where all organic life forms just burn to ash.
With it. An anticlimactic end to the galaxy's greatest threat. I say this could happen because unlike the Covenant and Forerunners, who are not only advanced but also established powers, the Flood in this case start off with basically nothing. The potential to create and tap into their hive mind intelligence exists in every single Flood spore. And indeed, despite them being almost completely eliminated in the Forerunner Flood War, the Gravemind in Halo seems to have perfect memories of it. So clearly there's something psychic going on with their intelligence, but nevertheless they have to go through a fairly lengthy process to actually reach it. Starting off with nothing but a single spore, it's entirely possible that the Imperium could deal with it before it reaches critical mass.
In a way, isn't this just the same thing as the Greenskins? Like, yeah, they start off on the back foot. Well, I mean, the previous Greenskins were a lot stronger than many things in the galaxy, but we're talking about modern 40k Greenskins. But eventually they grow into a massive tide if left unchecked. But you can exterminate them quite quickly as long as you realize what's going on and the proper procedures to take care of them. So yeah, I think for the most part this is the most likely scenario that would happen. As long as somebody realized it. But once the Flood hits its stride, then that becomes a lot more complex of a situation to determine what exactly would happen there and who would win.
Additionally, the UNSC and Covenant are capable of preventing it from reaching truly galactic proportions. It has been able to wrong foot all factions in Halo before, but if a shotgun can keep a combat form down, then a bolter certainly can as well. This scenario is also more or less likely depending on which world the Flood starts on, of course. Worlds like Hive worlds, while having a much higher amount of people to infect, effect on it also have a higher chance of attracting the attention of someone with a planet killer. When half of a hive suddenly looks like the worst kind of person at a convention smells like, you're gonna notice. Same goes for if they end up on a Tau world. I don't think the greater good is likely to include the flood in it. Trying to infect the Craft Lord Eldar initially would lead to them being sensed out and Darth Sidious to death, most likely. They would probably have a field day with the orcs, to be totally honest with you. While the average boy could certainly take on a combat form, it's the matter of them getting infected. And truth be told, in my opinion, I think the flood spores are going to be able to outfight the orc spores, or however you want to word that. If I have to
How would that even work? I don't know, man. Spore versus spore.
explain to you why the flood wouldn't get anywhere with a tomb world, then please kindly direct your attention to the nearest wall and headbutt it until the neurons in your brain realign themselves. And as for them spawning in a Tyranid-infested planet, honestly, it could go either way. The flood could doubtlessly absorb slain Tyranid bioforms. I mean, when they're dead, they're just meat. Hell, infecting dead corpses is a valid way of gaining soldiers and biomass/intelligence for a gravemind as far as the flood care. But as for living Tyranids,
I think it would be really interesting to see how the Tyranid hive mind would interact with the grave mind. Would there be some sort of epic psychic battle happening?
I'll leave that up to whatever you want to think. Maybe the flood can infect them like any other, maybe the Tyranids can't be infected, maybe they can, but the Tyranids might be able to combat it or adapt to it. Up to you, and your answer to this question determines how likely the flood can spread in this scenario. And there's always a couple of ways other factions could hinder the flood at this stage as well.
I don't think the Tyranids have ever had to deal with anything remotely similar. Like, I don't think they get sick, do they? They don't really seem the type. Has there ever been a case where Tyranids were just Nurgle corrupted? Because whenever I think Tyranid, I have a particular image in my mind, and I've never seen anything else depicted other than just your regular Tyranid. So yeah, coming up with a point of reference for this kind of theoretical situation is difficult.
Well, the flood can't infect demons any more than the Tyranids can eat them, so if this first flood spore spawns on a planet that's having a chaotic problem, it probably won't end well for the flood. And if the flood are really unlucky, the Necrons might catch wind of the flood spreading on an Imperial world and use that fancy Star Destroyer button they have. System goes supernova before the flood spreads, Necrons are laughing the whole time. Did you know it's more like a galactic yard charmer than a weapon? Neat stuff. Entirely unrelated, but I felt like throwing that in there for you. Now for scenario 2, the Flood are able to become another faction in Warhammer, not stomping, but not advancing much like everyone else in the setting. Now this one I'll go ahead and say is the least likely in my opinion, but for the fun of it, I'll talk about the situation. Much the same as the first, but there's no intelligent and or trigger-happy Inquisitor around to blow the Flood-infested planet to Kingdom Come. The Flood takes over the world and begins spreading across the local sector. Fleets are dispatched to halt the spread and eliminate the threat, but the Imperium underestimates the capabilities of the Flood. Each regiment sent to combat them just ends up joining their ranks. And as the Flood grows more in numbers, its intelligence rises in equal measure. Tactics of those sent to face it are memorized and dealt with as they come up anew. Eventually, a slew of planets are firmly under Flood control, infested beyond repair and never to be reclaimed. However, in the scenario, the Flood comes to a halt after an initial surge of growth. Once the Imperium and other races of the galaxy become accustomed to the threat, they learn a few key things. 1. For the love of God, eliminate any ships with Flood on them that are inbound. Security is going to need to be tightened to hell and back, and you better get used to shooting ships coming out of Flood-contested systems on sight, but it can theoretically be done. 2. If they land...
I mean, they would do that. As long as they realize the gravity of the threat, it's really a matter of time for the Imperium to understand what exactly they're facing. We do have the tools to combat it. We just need the understanding.
And on a world, devote every bit of resources you have to eliminating them, assuming you can't just blow it up. There is no threat higher than a Flood infestation on a planet, and if they show up, you need to eliminate that entire area. Even in Halo 3, when the UNSC was down to pretty much just Earth, they were willing to let half of Africa get glass because the Flood was just that much of a risk. 3. If the planet looks like it's going to be a goner, just nuke the entire thing. While it being incredibly difficult to manage, it's entirely possible that the Flood would become just another faction in the 40k setting if proper containment is followed. Containment in the traditional sense, of course, not containment in the destroy the entire galaxy with giant hula hoops sense. Funnily enough, this is one of those threats that might cause some of the factions to show some unity with each other. Much like the Tyranids, I see no reason the Tau and Imperium wouldn't work together against the Flood.
I mean, but the Tyranids being the threat that they are, it would be stupid not to work together, even if you hate each other. It's either both of you survive or everything gets consumed.
Same with the Eldar. Hell, if it was bad enough, maybe it'd even be like with the War of the Beasts, where Iron Warriors and Imperial Fist fought alongside one another. That'd be wild. Now, I say this is the least likely situation to happen because the Flood in my mind aren't really a threat you can stall like this. You can either get rid of them, or you're getting turned into fungal stew. Since they're not only going to gain numbers and intelligence, but knowledge of whatever they're infecting, as proved by how they could drive vehicles of the Covenant and UNSC no problem, as well as hijack foreigner ships, you'll have
I mean, it's called the Flood for a reason. It just never stops. As long as there is a tiny speck of it alive somewhere in the galaxy, you know for a fact that eventually it's going to come back. Which was why the Forerunners made the Halo rings in the first place, to completely wipe everything. It was the only practical way to get rid of the Flood. But even then, you just can't be sure that the Flood isn't out there somewhere in like the far reaches of the galaxy. The universe is too big to cover everything, so like how would you know?
Have a major problem where once they hit critical mass, there's no stopping them. For some reason, Google Docs auto-corrected critical mass to critical ass, which isn't important at all, but it made me chuckle, so I thought I'd let you all know that happened. Anyways, this critical mass problem is the same as in any zombie-related media. Granted, most zombies can't clear buildings in a single jump and outmath Isaac Newton, but it's the same problem of after a certain point, the apocalypse is coming by sheer weight of numbers. As for their intelligence, absorbing 1 million guardsmen might not tell them anything important. They might gain some colorful new words to call the regimental commissar.
It depends on who they infect. As I said, like if they're able to get their hands on a high-ranking official, somebody with a lot of knowledge as to the tactics and how the weapons are used, or even worse, how they're manufactured, then you might have an issue.
But that's it. But they still gain the intelligence of all those guardsmen added on top of one another for the Gravemind. Additionally, absorb the right tech priests and they know all about how the weapons they're facing and absorbing work. Absorb the right officer and you've got knowledge of the Imperial tactical and strategic plans for the area at that man's time.
This is actually a great idea. Just throw Confiscate in there, and then the Flood just runs away from everything. Although, if you did, you know, the Flood might gain this uncanny ability to just luck themselves out of any situation and get the best possible outcome somehow.
I'm a death. And do I really need to tell you why a Flood-infected and enhanced Space Marine would be bad news for anyone in a light-year radius? Though for all my talk of this being the most unlikely scenario, this is the one that would be the coolest with the Flood in as an army in 40k, since they certainly got the potential to be a kick-ass army. Flood Pure Forms would be fantastic models, and imagine something on tabletop like the Flood Carrier form. You send 1 or 2 of them into a unit of guardsmen, and if all goes well, you can infect them to your side. Imagine how cool of an army that would be. One that might start off where you can absorb the enemy into their side to turn the tide. Imagine the arrogant fate.
That would actually be a pretty cool faction that just plays very differently from everybody else. Although I feel like it would be incredibly difficult to balance within the 40k universe, or on the 40k tabletop.
Face of someone who brings a Titan to the game board. Now imagine that smug grin being wiped off as a swarm of popcorn models clamber over the thing and infect everyone in it and turn it against them. That would be cool. I don't care if it's unbalanced. It'd be fucking awesome, wouldn't it? Now, scenario 3, the one that is both the situation I think is most likely and the one that is going to once more rear accusations of me being a biased Halo fan. To address that second one first, yes. Now let the jerking off of Halo commence.
This is not your grave.
Not your grave.
But you are welcome in it.
The Flood begins on a planet and completely devours it. Unlike Scenario 1, the Imperium or Tau or whoever is in charge cannot eradicate the threat, and it begins rapidly spreading across the sector. Aside from them gaining strength in numbers as they grow, the main issue is their assimilation. Everything they assimilate not only gives them that creature's abilities and knowledge, but enhances their strength and agility as well. It's how a standard UNSC Marine that's infected can slap the Master Chief across the map despite him being a goddamn demigod of war. Additionally, them being perfectly able to use the tech of a race they assimilate means that if you don't eliminate the Flood with an army you send after them, they're going to know how to deal with you after the fact. The Flood Hive Mind begins as a proto-Gravemind, a largely defenseless blob creature. That being said, once one of these things are formed, the Flood vastly increases in intelligence and it will undoubtedly make itself impossible to reach, or at least as close to impossible as it can, therefore ensuring the Flood's intellectual capabilities rise alongside their physical ones. As for how a single Flood spore can grow to take over a whole species, it's the same way as every zombie thing ever, their exponential growth. 1 begets 2, begets 4, begets a whole fucking lot more. I think the Imperium's massive scale would screw them over in this case, in both the large scale and the small scale. In the small scale, I mean that literally in the case of all the big shit that they build. Imagine a single flood spore getting into a knight. With just a single infection form or airborne spore, the flood have a death machine. Now scale that up to a titan legion. Much like Nurgle and the Tyranids to some extent, they create a biosphere to spread themselves with. It even looks like a Nurglite chaos infection, funnily enough. All sick and gross and nasty ass looking. So any guardsmen deployed to a flood infested world might just find themselves feeding the Gravemind. The flood also have their own pure forms that are more than capable of holding their own in a fight. You've got stalkers, the ranged things they turn into that shoot needles at you, the flood tank, and of course the flood juggernaut. It was cut from Halo 2, and that's probably for the best because beating that thing on Legendary would make me cry. The Boulevard.
Oh, well, that's unfortunate. But, maybe for the best. It's probably cut for a reason.
Boulevard of Jackal snipers is already bad enough, but in terms of Warhammer, this thing is more of a damn dreadnought. It's the size of one, and it hits like one. On top of all the other crap they got from Halo Wars 2, I mean, look at these things. Ugh. Just to go a bit more into their infectious capabilities I mentioned earlier, it's important to remember that Foreigner AIs are fully sentient artificial people, at least in terms of how advanced they are. If the Flood can infect those, I see no reason the Flood would have any issues infecting machine spirits once it devotes effort to it. They might not even need to infect the pilot of a Knight or Titan, for instance, just its machine spirit. And if nothing else, part of the reason Medican Bias was corrupted by the Flood is because the Keymind convinced him to turn against the Forerunners. Some machine spirits are pretty damn close to just being AI if they aren't already, and the Flood Mind is so goddamn charismatic that it can convince them to betray the Imperium.
Well, in the Warhammer 40k universe, back before the Dark Age of technology, humanity had many forms of extremely advanced AI that it used throughout the galaxy. Do we have any currently stored away somewhere? Because I think AI has kind of just been straight up banned because of all the terrible things that happened with the AI revolution that went on. But if there is still something out there that is still functioning, then if the Flood gets their hands on that, it could just be game over. Granted, this is another what-if scenario, and the Flood actually has to do that in the first place, which could be nigh impossible, but something to think about.
This charisma naturally being helped by a healthy dose of corruption. And if you're thinking that something like this might take a while, remember the Flood are capable of infecting space-time itself. Even if it were to be the case that the Keymind has to individually talk to every single Titan spirit for years on end, that's not as much of a problem when the year-long conversation takes place over the course of about 5 minutes. And depending on how prevalent machine spirits truly are, the Imperium is even more fucked. A lot of what the Imperium calls machine spirits are actually just something like programs and stuff like a computer nowadays, so that's not that big of an issue. The Flood can probably infect it with the ye olde computer virus and make it not work, but that's just a single piece of equipment not working. Now well, but if the other end of that scale is true, and AI is truly a part of almost every major piece of Imperial equipment, the Flood may very well kickstart a second Men of Iron rebellion. And as far as things like servitors go, they can just infect those the old-fashioned way of popcorn ball to the spinal column. That's a computer and a person infected all at once. Just eat the guy plugged into the battleship's navigation system, and you've not only got yourself a pilot, you know how to pilot every other ship of its type. As the Flood infest more and more space, they only become more and more powerful. There's no spreading themselves out too thin here. Much like the Tyranids, the Flood hive mind can be directing an entire battlefield all at once.
Oh yeah, I didn't think about that. The Flood certainly does have a massive advantage if it gets the ball rolling, with the fact that they don't have to stop and create some sort of logistic lines or ferry supplies over or set up defensive perimeters. Whenever they get to infect something, they just keep on infecting other things, and everything that they infect just becomes much stronger than what it once was.
However, it's much harder to disrupt the Keymind's presence amongst the Flood. There's far less in the way of synapse creatures amongst the Flood, so you can't just shoot the big one and the Flood all turn into mindless beasts. At best, you can destroy the Gravemind overseeing the Flood, but there's a couple of problems with that. Problem 1, the Gravemind doesn't even need to be on the same planet to direct the Flood, and a Keymind undoubtedly has an even larger range as well. Problem 2, the Gravemind is minimum the size of a damn Titan. Some things I've read say its body might be hundreds of kilometers large, and if that's the case, nothing short of an orbital bombardment is killing that thing. Either way, you're gonna need some big guns to kill it. Problem 3, it's not just a giant blob. A proto-Gravemind is, but a Gravemind proper isn't, and in this scenario, the Flood are long past the stage of proto-Gravemind. A Gravemind, meanwhile, can launch things across space if it needs to. As in, pick up a Flood combat form, stuff it in a fleshy drop pod, and just catapult that bitch across the solar system. It does it in Halo 3 pretty frequently in the last level. Aside from that meaning that it can theoretically spread infections across the system, its gets in without even needing to send any proper Flood combat forms there. There's the much more direct issue of if it can do that, anything that tries to fight it is going to be turned into a Dark Souls bloodstain real goddamn quickly. Good luck fat rolling around this thing. As for the larger scale working against the Imperium, the Flood absorb their enemies as they do. The problem this poses for the Imperium is that there's a whole lot of people to infect, and as I keep saying, everyone infected is another Imperial that's now working against it. It's kind of like how in the World War Z book, China kept throwing men at zombies, not knowing that every time they lost a man, they gained a zombie to fight. Or rather, not really caring, which I doubt the Imperium would either, given that it's the Imperium.
Yeah.
Hell, if the Flood begins somewhere in the Ghoul Stars or another region of space uncharted to the Imperium, it might grow to critical mass, and then suddenly entire swaths of Imperial space are under attack by the parasite. Additionally, the Flood are more than capable of figuring out how to repurpose equipment to suit itself, and in the case of 40k, there is a lot of hive worlds, forge worlds, and more that can be taken over to produce armaments and ships from the Flood. Once the know-how of doing this is figured out by the hive mind, it's endless supplies of stuff for the Flood to produce to help their war effort. War effort, never-ending buffet, same difference, you know?
Thing.
And something I think is pretty neat is that I think it's likely the Flood will produce the exact same issue as a Tyranid Hive Fleet invasion, the Shadow of the Warp. It is, after all, a massively complex and overreaching intelligence stretching across time and space. Who's to say that the Flood can do the same thing as the Nids in this case? Albeit against the Flood, the Psykers go insane because some asshole won't stop speaking in iambic pentameter at them every time they try to use magic. No matter
Well, whichever method is the best method, I think the Flood would be able to quickly adapt to that. This still depends on like how a Flood infection would affect a Tyranid, but if they're able to gain that kind of knowledge from the Tyranids, then maybe they could even make a deadlier version of the Shadow of the Warp somehow.
For what the Imperium throws at the Flood, in this scenario it can't be stopped. World after world falls to it until they have devoured the majority of the Imperium, and mankind's fate is sealed along with the rest of the galaxy. The ever-present orcs will only present more food and soldiers for the Flood. The schemes of the Eldar are no match for the intelligence of the Keymind. Clearly, the Tau will survive and repopulate the galaxy, and I can't even finish this joke. They get stopped. It's straightforward. Space and time itself will begin to corrupt itself into a living hell, potentially preventing demons from manifesting in real space. This same issue will also plague the Tyranids. If space and time are absolutely Smeckledorf, then the Tyranids travel across the galaxy can be splintered and disrupted enough to make them easy pickings. Regardless, as industrial centers fall and armies are infected, the Flood will have more than enough manpower to handle Tyranid hive fleets. Kamara and the Black Library likely won't even be safe, as the moment a Webway Gate is found, it's time to go ballistic with the Flood spores. Even the
Bruh. Once they understand how it works, then yeah, it's pretty much over.
The forces of chaos will be forced to bow to the unending tide of the parasite pouring across the galaxy, with cultists and marines being infected and turned while demons are gunned down by their former servants. As for the endgame, the Flood will begin to finish with the rest of the holdouts amongst the galaxy. Depending on how powerful the Flood's absorption really is, there's a very real chance they might develop Psyker powers, in which...
Okay, question. Would Tzeentch be powerful enough to just kind of like snap his fingers and then get rid of the Flood entirely? I don't think we ever truly understand how powerful Tzeentch is. I'm just kind of working under the assumption that Tzeentch is so incredibly powerful, but it wouldn't want to win just because completely winning is boring. So he continues to play this game along with everyone else. But if a faction were to dominate, then what would happen? Would Tzeentch step in to rebalance everything? Was Tzeentch the game developer this entire time? Or am I just kind of overestimating his power?
In which case the precursors as they were are back now, just a lot grosser. You may say that being the god that he is, the Emperor could handle the Flood, and individually, of course that's true, there's no Flood form that'll manage to harm him. But as a god, he is weakened as his worshippers die off. And as the Flood consumes more and more, not only will he lose worshippers that deprive him of power, which to note is the same issue the Chaos Gods will face, he will also receive less and less Psykers to empower him. The daily dose of Psykers he needs to sustain himself will dwindle from the thousands to the hundreds to the dozens to finally none. The end of the Imperium in this scenario may not come from a Flood invasion of Terra, but a warp storm as he finally dies and chaos overtakes the cradle of man. As for the Necrons, you might think they'll be the inheritors of the galaxy, as robotic beings should be relatively safe, but this won't be so. The average Necron warrior could potentially be infected by the Flood's logic plagues they use to infect the machinery of other races. Even disregarding that, the Flood aren't just predators like the Tyranids, they're hateful. They want an unending hell of subjugation for all life. And the Necrons, while not technically alive anymore, are not likely to be spared the wrath of the insane remnants of the...
I mean, even if the Necrons weren't able to be infected, That doesn't mean that in this scenario where the flood has already overtaken most of the rest of the galaxy and gained a ton of knowledge, potentially a forge world to make weapons, that they wouldn't be able to just send just a massive military force against the Necrons that they wouldn't be able to fight against. However, on the flip side, the Necrons could also just break out their galaxy-busting devices and completely wipe them out, maybe. It's once again a what-if scenario, like, does the Flood have a countermeasure to that? Do the Necrons have something even more powerful that I'm not aware of? Is it just something that can't be countered? Hard to say, but we're kind of just on a roll here with the Flood winning over everything, so.
The precursors. As the Flood takes over the industrial centers of other realms, it will turn them towards the Necrons to eliminate them. It will learn the secrets of the Necrons' ultimate weapons and turn them against not only them, but the Catan, some of the only beings capable of threatening them that in their sharded state will be easy pickings for a massed Flood invasion. As the last of the mortal beings in the galaxy are consumed, on multiple levels it becomes an unrecognizable hell. Not only are infected planets turned into Flood worlds covered in their biomass, but space and time itself warp beyond recognition. The library in the Foreigner trilogy mentions that looking at the stars, they looked off somehow. Whatever the Flood were doing as they were wiping out the Forerunners, they were causing the galaxy to become wrong on a fundamental level. However they managed to do it, the end result is the galaxy becoming something closer to hell than anything we would know. Physics are entirely rewritten, much like how their star roads could rewrite reality to change their mass, and life may very well become impossible. Any chaotic incursions attempting to combat the Flood are dealt with easily, either by the unending tide of combat forms banishing them back to the warp, or because once in real space demons need to at least somewhat follow the laws of physics, the Flood can simply rewrite these laws to be to their advantage. The Eye of Terror will more than likely end up closed, as will the Great Rift, whether that be due to the Flood being able to build something similar to the Necron pylons, or the sheer psychic weight of the Flood hive mind shutting it down like the Tyranid Shadow in the warp. Either way, the end result is the same. As the last of their followers and mortal beings they draw sustenance from are infected, the Chaos Gods begin to wither and fade. The 40k galaxy is subsumed into the Flood. It may have taken another 40,000 years from the days of the Human Covenant War, and 140,000 years from when they nearly consumed the galaxy the first time around, but their victory is inevitable.
We exist together now. Two corpses in one grave.
And with that, I am done with the 3 Halohammer videos. I do hope you've all enjoyed the video series, as it was very fun to write and make. More. As I've said many a time, I love me some Halo. And even if you hated it, well, you can always make fun of me elsewhere on the internet, or in the comment section. I don't advise that one for your sake, because it'll just boost me in the algorithm and keep my garbage opinions of hate so much floating around, but if you really want to let me know how unbelievably stupid I am for these videos, then go for it. Don't think I'm done with Halo yet, of course. There's all sorts of lore videos about them I'd love to make. Between
Okay, well, you guys ever think that, maybe a YouTuber intentionally says something incorrectly in order to have a ton of people leave comments correcting that guy, and so that video gets boosted in the algorithm? That's like big brain tactics for YouTubers. But after saying that, I just want to be clear. If I say something incorrectly, that's probably because I just forgot about a particular aspect of whatever universe I'm trying to reference. I cover a lot of different lore around here, and while I would say that I do have a pretty good memory, it's not like I remember every single detail of every universe that we've ever looked at. I'm just the guy that thinks it's cool to learn about some new things.
In this series and the one about the Human Covenant War, it's been proven to me that people will watch it. I think next time I dive into Halo, we'll take a look at your friendly neighborhood office of naval intelligence. They do some shit the Imperium would say is too much, but that'll be sometime in the future.
Yeah.
This was quite the long video, as you can probably tell, so I'll be taking a break from Halo for now. Not for too long, of course, but long enough to get back to what you expect from a Warhammer channel. You know, Warhammer, and maybe some stuff about a phone company, if I have time. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the random person to my Flood infection form. I don't know how I can turn this into
make a return to Battle Tank.
Complimentary, so use your imagination.
Probably whenever I start streaming
Battle
Tank.
In all seriousness, thanks. For the first time in a while, I'm excited for what the new year will bring, and that wouldn't be the case without all of you watching my crap. Thanks for watching, and take care out there. Alright, now hear me out. Gravemind, right? Big scary monster, hateful and manipulative beyond belief, wants nothing more than to consume all life in the galaxy. I bet, and again, hear me out, he gives the sloppiest toppy in the universe.
Oh
Absolute
my
mad
god.
head game, that good old Gluck Gluck 3000.
Oh
you
my
might say
god,
that's bad.
Pancreas.
I say that's probably not even the top 5 most shameful things I've said on this channel. I know what can make that list though. Gravemind Dussy. Nah, I can do better than that. Flodussy. Wait,
No,
wait.
stop.
pre-cussy.